A while back, I did a video about co-op Metroidvanias. And since then, some new games have come out, and I've discovered some old ones. So here's some more couch co-op Metroidvanias. First, I want to start out with some games that aren't necessarily Metroidvanias, but they have some of the elements. An obvious choice is Bloodstained, Ritual of the Night. When this game first came out, they talked about including a co-op mode. So that's what originally piqued my interest with this game. Unfortunately, the co-op mode did not come out on release, so I waited patiently. Now about 6 years later, we finally are getting a co-op mode. But unfortunately, it's not the main game. This is just a side mode called Chaos Mode. So that makes this co-op mode not necessarily a Metroidvania. But this is a game heavily influenced by Castlevania, so I still wanted to mention it. In this mode, the players are put into a room and you must find your way out. You get random challenges, like destroying a specific number of enemies, fighting bosses, and just finding the exit. And it's a pretty solid experience to play with a friend, but of course, I would have preferred the full co-op story mode. That's a real Metroidvania. I honestly can't believe that never came out. It's very disappointing. This chaos mode is better than nothing. But while we're talking about Bloodstained, let's talk about Bloodstained Curse of the Moon 2. So when the original Bloodstained came out, there was a side game that came out called Curse of the Moon. The main Bloodstained game was heavily influenced by Symphony of the Night. This one was more influenced by the 8-bit Castlevania games, specifically Castlevania 3. And again, this one is not a Metroidvania, it's very linear. But when Curse of the Moon 2 came out, they also added a co-op mode. Yeah, this one's very linear. It retains the same formula as its predecessor, but there are some unique characters added with their own unique abilities. You're gonna have to play through some of the levels multiple times and take different routes. So this definitely encourages replayability. I think that this is an excellent co-op game, but it would have been cool if this had some more Metroidvania characteristics. But again, if you like 8-bit Castlevania, you're definitely gonna like this one too. And another game that doesn't quite fit into the Metroidvania formula, but it has some of the similar characteristics, let's talk about Todd's Adventures in Slime World. This game originally came out on the Atari Lynx in 1990. It was later ported to the Sega Genesis and the PC Engine CD. There's a lot to love about this game. On its surface, it just looks like a normal platformer, but it actually has some Metroidvania mechanics, as you're going to be exploring a lot around this area. The standout feature of the Atari Lynx version is that you can play this game with up to 8 players. Of course, I've never come anywhere near this. I've only been able to play it with 2 players, but it's definitely a lifelong goal to be able to play the 8-player version of this game. I can't imagine how that would run. And from what I've read, it's the first 8-player game ever made. Unfortunately, this game does have some downsides. The music and sound effects are just terrible. Some of the worst I've ever heard. And the gameplay itself is very slow. The controls are kind of frustrating, but some things that I do enjoy, I mentioned the exploration, that's definitely a unique feature, but also I like that as you take damage, you start to become more and more green, like you're getting covered in slime. And in order to heal yourself, you jump into a pool of water, then you start washing yourself off. That's just some nice attention to detail. I like that you can climb on walls, and you can get a number of power-ups here. Unfortunately, the main water gun that you have, it just kind of sucks. But you can get a triple shot, a slime gun, and you can also get bombs as well as a jetpack. The jetpack is definitely going to help with your exploration. Even though this game feels very dated by today's standards, I still have a soft spot for it. It's definitely a game that I can't recommend to everybody, but if you want to find something that's a little bit more slow paced, that you can just take your time with, and you can explore every nook and cranny with a friend, or 7, then maybe this is the game for you. Silver Knight Crusaders. This is not an official release, it's actually a fan game, created using Open Beats of Rage. This game does utilize a lot of Castlevania assets, but don't let that deter you. This is actually a really solid experience, and it stands on its own. You can play through the entire game in 2-player co-op. There are 3 playable characters and a pretty decent storyline. You can play through the entire game in about an hour, but I think that's the perfect length for this type of game. When it comes to Open Beats of Rage games, they're kind of a mixed bag. But this is definitely a top tier one that's a must play. Oh yeah, did I mention it's a free game, so there's no reason not to try it. But unfortunately, you can only play it on PC. Let's talk about Outland. This is a game that totally went under my radar. Even though I've had it in my Steam library for years, I never actually paid attention to it. I must have bought it on a sale or something, and then just never played it. And this is kind of an older one. It came out in 2011 on PS3 and Xbox 360. The main thing that immediately stood out to me are the visuals. It's got a very dark and kind of silhouette look. I like it, it's unique. But then the gameplay stands out as well. I've heard it often compared to Ikaruga meets Castlevania, and that's because it plays kind of like a bullet hell platformer. You and your teammate are going to switch between colors. So as the bullets approach you, if they're blue, you want to switch to blue, and then they'll pass through you. And then if they're red, you're going to want to switch to red. So very similar to Ikaruga. I've never really seen this played out in a platforming setting, so that's pretty cool. The combat's really solid. You have a sword, you can climb on walls, and of course, there's lots of exploration here. Another standout for me were the boss fights. There are some really huge and detailed bosses. Usually while you're fighting them, there's going to be bullets coming from the sky and from all directions. So it has kind of a puzzle mechanic as well. Not only are you going to have to focus on fighting the enemy, you're going to need to dodge and switch between your blue and red colors in order to evade the bullets as well. I don't know how I missed this game, but it is very solid. Definitely one of my favorite games from this era. I just wish that I found it sooner. Anima Flux is a 2-player co-op Metroidvania, and this is a game that you can just tell it was built around co-op. It's not a secondary thought. This game has some really beautiful hand-drawn cutscenes and an interesting story. Each character has their own unique abilities. Eileen is a ranged fighter, and she uses a bow and arrow, and Roy is a swordsman, so he's going to be mostly doing close combat attacks. Like most Metroidvanias, you're going to do a lot of exploration here, and you're going to gather power-ups in order to move through new environments. I love this genre, and there's just not enough co-op Metroidvanias. This one's not my favorite in the genre, but I still recommend it. But I do think that the art style and the visuals are a lot stronger than the actual gameplay itself. Pampas and Selene. This is a 2D Metroidvania that can be played in 2-player co-op. The whole game is in split screen, which works really well for these types of games because you can split up and explore the environment separately. And it's easy to get together. By just holding in a button, you can teleport to your partner. Visually, this game reminds me of a Master System game or maybe MSX. Pampas is the warrior character. He has a sword and a bow and arrow. And Selene is the witch, and she's able to shoot lightning bolts, and her secondary attack is a fireball. You don't see a ton of co-op Metroidvanias, and this is honestly one of the best I've ever played. Leif's Adventure. This is a game I've had on my wish list for a really long time, but it's basically an action platformer with some Metroidvania type of elements. Once you get through the intro of the game, you can play it in co-op. The second player takes control of the ghost, and this is kind of an assist mode. They're able to stun enemies to help you fight, and they're also able to use their magic to reveal items and platforms and things like that to help you navigate through the level. I wasn't the biggest fan of the art style here, but I do think that the game is pretty fun and has a decent co-op assist mode. 2023 was a great year for co-op 2D platformers, and Disney Illusion Island is another one to add to the list. This is somewhat of a continuation of the Mickey Mouse games that came out on the Sega Genesis. Castle of Illusion and World of Illusion are the games that I loved playing as a kid, especially World of Illusion, as it had co-op gameplay. I still think that game holds up. This implements a lot of that same mechanics. Obviously the platforming, but you can also drop a rope down to help a friend. This is the perfect game for less experienced players, or for children, as there's no combat. It's all about exploration. So if you want to try an easier Metroidvania, definitely play Disney Illusion Island. Shrine Maiden Shizuka. This is a new Sega Genesis game, and it has a really cool assist mode where a second player can push start at any time and join in as this little frog character. He's able to shoot projectiles, which is very helpful. I love the visuals here. It's very cartoony and colorful. I absolutely love the soundtrack for this first part that We don't see enough Metroidvanias on the Sega Genesis, and we definitely don't see enough co-op Metroidvanias, so this is one that I was really excited about. There hasn't been any new updates though in a few years, so I really don't know what the status of this one is, but from what I played, I really liked it. It feels very polished, except for it did crash on us while we were playing it, so there is that problem. But ultimately, the gameplay in and of itself feels solid. Now how about a couple of new games that haven't come out yet, starting with Primal Planet. This one is supposed to come out sometime in 2025. You can play this one in 2-player co-op, and it's stated to have an emotional story that's told with no dialogue, which is always appealing to me. This one seems to have some exploration, but it also has some crafting elements as well. I really like the pixel art here. This definitely reminded me of the animated series Primal. Not only the prehistoric setting, or the protagonist is a caveman, but also it just seems to tell a story with some emotional depth with very little dialogue. I wonder if it took some inspiration from that series. Either way, I'm definitely excited for this game. And finally, let's talk about Gal Guardians, Servants of the Dark. I played the original Gal Guardians, and I included it in my first Metroidvania video. This is another one that's definitely more on the side of Castlevania than Metroid, but I really enjoyed the first game. This seems to be more of the same, it has a nice pixel art style, and it still retains the 2-player co-op, where one player specializes in long distance moves with a gun, and the other player specializes in close combat with a whip. The original game was pretty linear, so I'm interested to see if they add some more exploration in this one. But it looks like this one comes out in March of 2025. So there you go, there's some more couch co-op Metroidvanias. Some old and some new. If you enjoyed this video, make sure you check out our last video where we talked about the top 20 couch co-op Metroidvanias. So if there are any games that I didn't talk about in this video, maybe I talked about them in that video. If you watched both of those, and if there are any couch co-op Metroidvanias that we missed, let us know in the comments. And thanks for watching.